opens central lines, aiming for quick piece development and eventual queenside pressure. Immediately contesting the center establishes equality and opens up possibilities for both sides' pieces. Developing the knight here contests central influence and prepares for further expansion, aiming for harmonious piece placement. Developing a piece to a central square, this establishes immediate counterplay against white's central pawn structure. Challenging the center's stability, this pawn advance injects immediate tension and fights for crucial central squares. Solidifying the center and preparing to develop the dark-squared bishop, this move adopts a defensive posture often seen in Queen's Gambit decline structures. Solidifying central control, nc3 prepares for kingside development and potentially supports a future e4 push, aiming for harmonious piece coordination. Pinning the knight immediately disrupts white's central pawn structure and forces them to address the tactical threat, potentially hindering their development. Solidifying the center pawn structure now prepares a flexible pawn advance, subtly claiming more dominion over key squares while reinforcing the knight's presence. Securing the king's safety with castling is a paramount early goal, preparing for central pawn thrusts and potential piece activity. Developing the bishop to d3 prepares for a potential queenside pawn advance and reinforces the center, while also looking to exchange off black's active bishop. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies the central pawn structure and prepares for future queenside expansion, while also subtly contesting control of the d4 square. Challenging the bishop's position, this pawn push prepares to either exchange it or gain space on the queenside, forcing black to decide on their bishop's future and potentially opening a diagonal for white's own pieces. Sacrificing the bishop for knight exchanges simplifies the position, creating a pawn majority on the queenside and potentially opening a diagonal for black's remaining bishop later. This maneuver alters the pawn structure significantly, setting the stage for a strategic battle where piece activity and pawn breaks will be crucial. Opening the queenside pawns dramatically alters the pawn structure, creating doubled c-pawns, but also a powerful central pawn majority and a clear path for the queen. That knight's adventurous hop to the rim immediately grabs attention, seeking to disrupt white's pawn structure or perhaps reposition for a future sortie on the queenside, a classic idea of rerouting to a more influential square. Reinforcing the d4 pawn and preparing to contest the central dark squares, this knight reroutes towards a more active diagonal, eyeing the queenside and potentially bolstering the center if a future pawn advance occurs. Striking for central space, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's harmonious development and potentially unravel the queenside pawn structure. The immediate consequence is increased tension, forcing white to decide whether to accept a more closed position or engage in pawn exchanges that could open lines. Solidifying central control and preparing to activate the queenside pieces, this castling maneuver simultaneously brings the king to safety and connects the rooks, laying the groundwork for future operations along the open files, particularly the d-file if black opts for dxc5. Initiating the queenside expansion, black carefully prepares to challenge white's central pawn structure and activate their light-squared bishop. The intention is to exert pressure on the d4 pawn and open lines for potential counterplay, a subtle yet important step towards solidifying their position. This maneuver aims to disrupt white's harmonious development and create dynamic possibilities on the queenside in the coming moves. Embracing the open c-file, this capture aims to disrupt black's central pawn structure and prepare for a more active piece deployment. White is seizing the initiative by clarifying the pawn tension and potentially creating isolated pawns for black down the line, which can become targets in the middle game. Consider how this exchange reshapes the landscape, potentially opening avenues for white's pieces to infiltrate black's territory. Opening the center with this pawn recapture invites immediate contact, creating a dynamic pawn structure where black's isolated d-pawn will become a target, demanding careful defense. Solidifying the d4 pawn's defense while preparing to potentially challenge the central d-file, this move subtly aims to gain a touch more breathing room for white's pieces. It also discourages black's knight from hopping into the potentially annoying c4 square and hints at a future kingside pawn push, creating long-term strategic options. Black repositions the rook to the open e-file, establishing a powerful central presence and eyeing potential exchanges or tactical incursions. Strategically repositioning the rook to the open e-file aims to contest control and apply pressure on black's d5 pawn, potentially creating future attacking chances along the central files. This maneuver by black seeks to activate the bishop, aiming it towards the weakened light squares on white's kingside, and offering a potential exchange on d3 that could relieve pressure and open lines for black's rooks. The rook suddenly surges to the second rank, an unusual repositioning that aims to challenge the open c-file and potentially swing over to the kingside. This maneuver suggests white is preparing for a more active defense or perhaps an offensive foray, seeking to coordinate pieces more effectively than before. It's a curious sidestep, a strategic repositioning that might be aimed at avoiding immediate pressure or creating new avenues for attack, a subtle shift in the positional equilibrium. Black's rooks now eye open files, preparing to challenge white's central control and potentially disrupt the pawn structure on the queenside. Repositioning the knight from the f3 square to f1 is a subtle but deep idea, aiming to reroute it via g3 to h5 or potentially e3, seeking more active squares and reinforcing the kingside defense against any potential black initiative along the c-file or on the queenside. Clearing the central tension opens up the d-file, creating immediate potential for battery formation along that open pathway. Black aims to exploit this by activating their rook, but must remain vigilant about the potential for white's knight to jump to c4 and disrupt black's queenside coordination. Reclaiming the central pawn allows white to establish a robust pawn chain and contest control of the d-file, a crucial conduit for piece activity, while simultaneously preparing to develop the queen's bishop and solidify the kingside. Initiating an offensive thrust on the kingside, black gambles on creating immediate chaos, hoping to pry open lines against white's castled monarch before the central structure solidifies. This aggressive pawn advance, while potentially destabilizing, risks overextension if white can skillfully parry the ensuing threats and consolidate their advantage. Establishing a defensive pawn chain on the kingside aims to solidify white's king position, preventing any immediate pawn breakthroughs by black's advanced pieces on the queenside and center, while preparing for potential counterplay on the kingside itself. Launching the kingside pawn attack with h4 immediately signals an aggressive intent, aiming to pry open lines for black's pieces towards white's king. This pawn push creates a spatial imbalance, potentially overextending black's structure if white can effectively counter. The question becomes whether black has sufficient support for this aggressive forward march, or if it will ultimately leave their own king exposed. Consider the long-term implications of weakening the pawn shield in front of your monarch. The rook's relocation to f2 initiates a subtle yet significant repositioning, aiming to activate this piece from its passive initial placement on the third rank and prepare for potential action on the central files or even an assault on black's kingside. White seeks to untangle his pieces, particularly the light-squared bishop on d3, which is currently somewhat restricted by its own pawn chain. This maneuver is a testament to the idea of improving your worst-placed piece, with the f2 rook potentially finding a more dynamic role by supporting central play or assisting in a kingside initiative, should black commit to an aggressive pawn push. Shifting the queen to d7 readies black for a potential kingside advance, or can offer support for a central pawn break. Unleashing a central pawn thrust now aims to shatter black's harmonious pawn chain and open lines, potentially forcing weaknesses around the monarch. Initiating a pawn exchange in the center, black immediately opens lines and challenges white's central control, aiming to exploit the newly created diagonal for their pieces and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure. Liberating the f-file is the immediate consequence, opening a potential path for the rook toward the enemy king's territory or to reinforce critical central squares. This pawn sacrifice dramatically alters the pawn structure, aiming to disrupt black's carefully constructed defensive setup and create dynamic counterplay. The strategic intent is to exploit the newfound space and activity that the white rooks will gain, potentially threatening lines of attack that were previously blocked. It's a bold step, inviting tactical skirmishes, and suggests a willingness to engage in a more open and aggressive middle game, even at the cost of material or a slightly weakened pawn formation around the king. Consider the implications for black. They must now decide whether to capture the pawn immediately, accepting a more open board, or to maintain their current structure, allowing white to develop their pieces with greater freedom. The pawn push on e4 has created a central tension that will likely define the next phase of the game. A calculated gambit of space for activity, this bishop repositions to a biting diagonal, threatening white's queenside structure and opening avenues for infiltration. Aimed at wresting control of the central files, this queen redeployment immediately challenges black's pawn structure and prepares for potential advancements on the king side. Clearing the **c4*** square for the bishop offers a dynamic pivot, potentially redeploying it to a more active diagonal or preparing for a later gambit, while simultaneously challenging white's control of that crucial central intersection and preparing to contest the open **c*** file. Shifting the bishop to c2 appears to be a preparatory maneuver, aiming to potentially double rooks on the c-file or to provide a defensive screen for the king. It also indirectly influences the central squares and prepares for future pawn advances or exchanges, although its immediate impact is subtle. Unleashing the knight to b3 seizes control of the important c5 square, potentially disrupting white's central pawn structure and creating threats against the bishop on c2. Challenging the bishop's entrenched position on c4, white forces a pawn structure alteration. This exchange will relieve the pressure on white's king, which has been somewhat confined, and simultaneously opens the b-file for potential counterplay. Observe how the queenside pawns will now be isolated for black, a potential long-term weakness to exploit. Black's bishop, having bravely maneuvered all the way from c8 to b3, now exerts considerable pressure along the a2-g8 diagonal and directly challenges the exposed white king. This unexpected outpost can cause significant discomfort for white, potentially leading to piece exchanges that favor black's development or opening up lines for future attacks. The question is whether white can adequately address this powerful bishop's presence without creating new weaknesses. Unleashing a pawn thrust towards the enemy king, this advance aims to disrupt black's tightly packed pieces and potentially open lines for white's rooks and queen, creating an immediate tactical interrogation of the black army's current arrangement. The knight's repositioning to d5 injects a dynamic element, targeting the strategically vital e3 pawn and potentially disrupting white's central control, while also preparing to support a future c4 pawn push for space. The queen's sudden appearance on g5 aims to exploit the weakened kingside, threatening immediate mating patterns that black needs to address with utmost care. Reclaiming the initiative, black repositions the queen to a more active square, setting up potential threats and preparing to contest the crucial central squares that white has aggressively seized. Shifting the queen to g4 creates a potent battery along the g-file, aiming squarely at black's vulnerable kingside, while simultaneously reinforcing the central pawn structure and probing for weaknesses. Solidifying the central presence and preparing for a potential exchange on the d-file, this maneuver anchors the rook and creates a more robust pawn structure for black. Activating the bishop to pin the knight and disrupt black's coordination. The queen boldly ventures into enemy territory, threatening to dismantle white's queenside pawn structure. However, this daring foray might leave her exposed to a swift counterattack from the centralizing knight and bishop. Unleashing the queen to d7 aims to pry open the e-file and potentially target weakened pawns, but overlooks the immediate threat of black's rook now dominating the third rank and the queen's precarious position.